Yeah, the next talk, it's already shown here. Aimee van Wynsberghe from the Netherlands perfect, is here to give a talk about ethics and gender data gap. And this is obviously related to your CV. She studied applied ethics in Leuven. And then a PhD also in applied ethics from University of Twente. After that, assistant professor also in Twente. And now since 2017, assistant professor at Department Values, Technology and Innovation, TU Delft, the Netherlands. Yes, and perhaps I should highlight some of the achievements. Member of the European Commission High-Level Expert Group on Artificial Intelligence and L'Oréal UNESCO Women in Science Laureate. So, perfect. Okay, then ethics and robots. Floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here today. We were just talking about what a wonderful topic this is, and so happy to be a part of it. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is to give you a different sort of question to put in your mind, right? So I am not someone who builds robots or who is programming robots. I study robot ethics. So I'm really looking at the societal implications of this technology. How do we design it? How do we develop it? How do we regulate it? All of those kinds of questions, yeah? And really, yeah, to sort of put everyone's minds in the right place, instead of asking what we can do with this technology, what robot ethics and what robot ethicists ask of us is to say, what should we do with this technology? How should we create it? What capabilities should these robots have? Where should we use them? Yeah, in what context and for what purposes? Okay? And because of the theme of today, the International Day of Women and Girls in Science, I thought that I would also address this one particular issue, which is the lack of women in STEM. And so the implications that this has for robots. And it's not just having a team that doesn't have a adequate representation between gender balances, but it's also about the cycle that this creates, that we have genderized products that are being made, or we have an unequal impact between genders of the robots that are being made. So I want to get into that as well. But first, what I want to do is to just tell you a little bit about myself, because I think that also helps to shape the story that I want to tell. So I'm actually from Canada, even though the name is very Dutch. But I'm from Canada, and I studied cell biology while I was there. And while I was studying cell biology, I worked at a place called CSTAR, which stands for Canadian Surgical Technologies and Advanced Robotics. And I was part of a team, so this is before ethics. There's no ethics in my life at this point, right? And, well, I mean, no. I mean, I wasn't studying ethics. So yeah, we're off to a great start. Yeah. So I'm a part of the team, and I'm actually one of the technical researchers, right? So we're training surgeons how to use surgical robots, the Da Vinci surgical system, and we were also actually working with the Zeus telesurgical system, so doing long-distance remote robotic surgery. And while I was a part of this team, I kept asking what my boss would call inconvenient questions. And I would say, how do the surgeons feel about this? I mean, this is a paradigm shift for surgery. The surgeon isn't touching the patient anymore, right? Like surgery is about touching hands in patients or laparoscopic tools in patients. And this wasn't happening anymore. So I was asking these questions. How do they feel? How do the nurses feel? What's happening to the nurse's role? How does the patient feel? Are we doing follow-ups with the patients and that kind of thing? And so, yeah, my boss said, well, this isn't really what we're trying to do here, Aimee. You know, we're working on the efficacy and the effectiveness of this tool, and can we make it work? He said, but I think what you're talking about is ethics. So I took a detour, and I decided that I would go and learn what ethics is, and see if I could apply it to robots. And that has brought me to where I am today over at the Technical University of Delft, where a part of my job is really trying to uncover what are the ethical issues related to robotics and artificial intelligence. How do we make sense of them? You know, like what is going on? It doesn't just sort of pop up, come to us. We have people who are investigating these technologies. And then about 4 years ago, myself and Noel Sharkey, for anyone who's into Robot Wars, he's the head judge on Robot Wars, he and I, we started to realize that, we were talking about all of these issues, these things that were coming up, but it only took us so far to be presenting it at a conference, right? Or to be talking to other ethicists because they weren't making the robots. What could they do about it? So we decided to create the Foundation for Responsible Robotics. And the whole idea behind this was to bring academics together with industry developers, also together with policymakers, right? Because we are in a pinnacle moment right now where the European Commission, the European Parliament are trying to decide what kind of regulation do they want to have for robotics and artificial intelligence. And there's a lot of pressure from both sides, right? You have civil society organizations saying, regulate today or yesterday. And then you have the big tech companies who are saying, no, you're going to stifle innovation. And we're competing with China. We're competing with the United States. So it's a hot topic, and we wanted to be a part of this conversation. I also am a fellow at Deloitte at the Center for the Edge, so I'm also trying to speak directly to the companies to help them just sort of reflect and to think about, take a step back. What is it that they are making, or in terms of data collection? What are they collecting? Are they allowed to collect this? So in each of these roles, though, whether I'm in academia, public outreach, in the corporate space or policymaking space, I'm trying to use ethics as a resource to say that instead of ethics being the typical, don't do that, oh, that's bad, what are you doing, that's wrong, instead, can we shift our perception of what ethics can actually do for us? And it can not only help to inspire new ways of creating products, but it can be, an incredible piece of the puzzle to good design. Right? We can use ethicists as a part of the design team to help uncover different kinds of risks that we might encounter, to understand why they are risks. So a lot of times you hear that there's a risk to privacy, right? If robots are involved, or if AI is involved, or data collection practices, there's a risk to privacy. But what does that mean? Right? It can mean very different things to different people. And that's part of the role of the ethicist, to help us understand what it means. So in a healthcare context, if you were talking about privacy, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, privacy was really about, is the curtain enclosed around the patient's bed? Or, those beautiful gowns that you wear as a patient, is it closed behind you so that you can't see through the gown? Right? Privacy was about your body. But now, privacy, the first thing that everyone thinks of is data privacy. Right? So our privacy, our concept of privacy and what is involved with privacy is changing. And now the future of privacy is already about, when we think about machine learning, when you put different strands of information and data together, you can disclose new kinds of information about people and about patients. So our privacy is also about our online identity, or this idea of not having control over decisions that could be made about us in the future. So the ethicist has this role to play in understanding what's going on and helping other people to understand and make sense of what's going on, and then you can do something about it. Then you can prevent these risks that might be flagged, or you can mitigate these risks that might be flagged. And so in my research, I consider this idea of the ethicist or ethics as a resource, as a tool, and it's one of the pieces of responsible robotics. So I'm certainly not here to say ethics is going to solve everything. We're done. Just put the ethicist in. Absolutely not. I think that ethics is one part of the equation here, that we need ethicists to work together with engineers, roboticists, computer scientists, and we need, the three sort of actors or stakeholders working together. The policymakers have to understand what it is you're developing, and also have to understand and make sense of what it is that the ethicist is talking about. So getting into what I want to talk about today, responsible robotics is huge, or robot ethics is huge, and I want to just touch on one sort of cycle that I'm seeing happening. And this cycle, of course, starts with, a theme of today, this lack of women in STEM. And what I suggest is that this lack of women in STEM can lead us into a kind of vicious cycle. That we have something called a gender data gap. And this is, I lift this from Carolyn Criado Perez, and she wrote a wonderful book called Invisible Women, which I'll get into a little bit later. But she talks about the fact that women aren't equally represented in data. And this is now going to be problematic because so much of our world is based on data these days. Right? So if we have a lack of female presence, this leads to a kind of gender data gap. And without the representation or the voice of both genders in this situation, or multiple genders, right? I should also say gender is fluid, yeah? So I bracket that, and right now we'll just talk about a certain binary distinction. And there's an impact then. Technologies become gendered. They look in a certain way. They look either male or female, depending on the task that the robot is going going to be used for. And then they also have a disproportionate impact depending on the gender, whose jobs are being displaced or what kinds of jobs are being displaced. So that's something that I want to get into today, and then how this also feeds back into creating this cycle, that if women are experiencing robots differently from men, they might not be as interested in the technology. They might not be as interested in studying the different fields that are relevant for robotics. So, but first I take one step back to just say, what is ethics, yeah? Because I know that this is the only talk on ethics today, so I'll at least give you like 20 seconds of what ethics is. So, depending on who you ask, you'll get a variety of different answers, right? Some people might tell you that ethics is the study of right action. So, what it means to determine or to decide that an action was good or bad. Some people could tell you that ethics is really about what it means to be a good person, right? Developing virtues, what it means to have good character traits. How do I evaluate myself or other individuals in society as a good person? But I think a really helpful way of conceptualizing what ethics is for this particular topic was one of the older conceptions, the Aristotelian version. And this is that ethics is the study of the good life, what it is and how we can achieve it, the good life. And of course, being a good person is a part of, what it means to live a good life or to feel that others are living a good life. And we use a certain kind of language to talk about this. We use values, right? Values and principles. And when you realize values and principles, you can say that you have a good life. When you feel as though your privacy, safety, security, well-being are realized, you feel as though you have a good life, right? So values are the kind of components of the good life. And then when we're talking about robot ethics, right, then we can frame it as in the study of the impact of robots on the good life. So looking at how robots are designed, developed, regulated, used, the entire life cycle of the robot, how that impacts the values of the good life. So that's when you might hear some companies or some individuals talking about persons who are older and they want to live in their home longer. They don't want to go to a nursing home, and a robot in the home or a personal assistant could help them to do that. It could help them maintain autonomy, right? This value of the good life. So we hear robots being very concretely and explicitly suggested to help enhance the good life or to help us realize the good life. But we also hear that they can threaten, right? So if you think of a kind of quasi-robot, more embodied intelligence, Amazon Alexa, that it's always on and it's always listening and it's created to this sort of mentality of surveillance and it's threatening our privacy, right? So there's another narrative that robots could enhance the good life, could help us realize it, but they could also threaten the values that are the core to the good life. So robot ethics is looking at all of these kinds of questions. Some of the other issues, privacy, right? So I was just touching on Amazon Alexa. But there's this idea, if you encounter a robot in the hospital, you walk into the hospital or you walk into a grocery store. I'm a part of a project right now where they're developing robots that will greet you in the grocery store, will help stack things. Do we need to have new kinds of informed consent? Do you need to consent? Do you want to know what data the robot is collecting? Do you care? So we're in the middle of having these conversations right now. What does privacy mean, and how should it be linked with something like informed consent in public, semi-public spaces? Hello Barbie, I don't know if you're familiar with this. Actually, Germany has banned Hello Barbie, but these are, like the AI-driven robots, the AI-driven dolls that can record conversations. It's usually just sort of linked with your Wi-Fi network. Record conversations has a database of something like 800 sentences, and so it has a nice interactive conversation with your child. And I think when it was released back in 2015, it took 6 days, maybe even less, before hackers could infiltrate and have direct communication with your children. So, I mean, amazing that we didn't think about this before. But safety and security issues, right? And these, if you're thinking about the good life and all of these values, like these are cornerstone values, and robots are having an impact on these values. Another one, if we're talking about machine learning algorithms being, the driving force behind the robot, then you get into the whole AI ethics conversations, right? Then you start talking about the black box of the algorithm. We don't know how a decision was made. And we get into conversations about, are we comfortable with robots being able to make predictions or to make recommendations, and we have no idea why that suggestion was made? Are we comfortable with that? And then this links in with some other sort of traits that we have, that humans have with technology. In North America, this is usually common for everyone because these things happened in North America. But when the GPS first came out, the GPS, the TomTom, or what is it called here? The GPS system, yeah? And it's in your car and it's your navigator. Do you remember when people used to drive into the lake because the GPS told them to do so? Do you guys remember those stories? I guess it was more common in North America. But just imagine it. You're driving down the road, and you see that the road goes straight ahead of you. To the left is a lake, and your GPS, your technology tells you to go left. And you look ahead, and the road is going there. You can see it with your senses, and you turn left and drive into a lake. It's amazing, isn't it? That we will ignore our senses, we will ignore our common sense, our practical, our critical thinking, our judgment, because the technology told us to do so. So these are some of the other things that robot ethicists are trying to grapple with. What do you do when a robot tells you to do something and you're not being critical? There's already stories in the States, too, where they're running experiments like this, where they show that it's an emergency evacuation scenario, and you have all of these people come in, and the robot intentionally breaks down, and someone comes in and says, "Oh, sorry, the robot broke down, beep, beep, boop, boop, gonna fix it, la, la, la," and then leaves. It's all part of the experiment. And then all of a sudden, the lights go down, there's smoke coming in from the doors, the red light is flashing, and the people in the experiment have two options. They can go to the emergency exit, the signs that are lit up, or they can follow the robot that is directing them to a dark room with no discernible exit, with no visible exit. And which way do they go? They go into the dark room, right? And this is a very small sample size, but this is indicative of the lengths that we're willing to go to, right? We will trust our technology. And it's one thing when we're, laughing about people driving into lakes, but it's another thing when we get into situations where robots are a part of this sort of socio-technical system, where they are reminding us to take medication. Or you have a machine learning algorithm that is predicting a different dosage or different times to take medication, and we don't question it, and we trust it. Yeah? So this is the kind of scope, the huge sort of questions that robot ethics is trying to tackle. And there's some of us in the robot ethics space that are trying to, suggest that instead of ethics being this afterthought, instead of having Hello Barbie be a commercially available product, and then all of us, afterwards sitting back and thinking, oops, that wasn't such a good idea, going through the research and development, going through product development, instead of that kind of situation, we should start with ethics. It should be something that is integrated into research and development, into product development, so that we don't have those kinds of situations. So if you take that thinking, and you take what are robot ethicists trying to do, ethics as a resource, understanding what's going on. Now let's get into this idea of the cycle of women in STEM and where I wanted to go with this, okay? So one of the ethical issues that a lot of people, and I say ethical, but it's really, like a societal issue that people are talking about. That is what happens when robots and automation in general are introduced into the workplace. They will perform better than humans at some tasks, yeah? And so people are worried that everyone's going to lose their jobs to robots or to algorithms, that they're going to be replaced because the system can perform it better. There's a ton of studies out. I think Frey and Osborne were the first ones that came out with this a few years ago. Now, the percentages range from something like 23% to 50-something percent. Depending on which report you read, you get a different percentage of jobs that will be replaced by robots. And then you have the other side of the story. We have large organizations like the World Economic Forum talking about the millions of jobs that are going to be created. Like, don't worry, we got this. There's going to be so many jobs, whether it's building robots, whether it's programming robots, fixing robots. This isn't the end of the conversation, right? We don't just say jobs are gone and then we have to worry. But something else to think about. Where will those jobs be created? Right? Who is going to have those jobs? So we don't get that much farther in the conversation. One side of the story is we're worried about jobs. The other side is, don't worry, we're going to have lots of jobs. We don't have to worry about that. But then if you really start to think about it, okay, the gains are going to be in these STEM fields. We need all of these different kind of disciplines. And then take it a step further. Who's already in STEM fields and who is going to continue to be in STEM fields? This is from the States, but I imagine you're all aware that the numbers aren't even this good in Europe, right? In the UK, there was that 11% movement, right? Or the whole campaign. 9% or 11%. And you know, people would have it written on their hands, and there's like Twitter photos all over the place, because it was 9% of women that are represented in the tech and innovation space. 9%. Right? That's not very good. I'm not into statistics, but I'm pretty sure that's not very good. And then where does that lead us, right? Okay, so this is where we get into this idea, this concept of the gender data gap. And so what Carolyn Criado Perez was trying to say was, you know, and she doesn't talk about robots. This is me sort of taking from one and extrapolating it or trying to move it into another domain. But she said that, you know, right now the way that the world sees people, a person, is as a man. And you know, intuitively, perhaps it's not an evil thing, right? But there are some consequences to this. And when you look at the consequences, it does become much more problematic. So think about scenarios where individuals are experiencing a heart attack. Normally, the way that we understand a heart attack is by observing male patients. So we know that they have certain symptoms, right? Clutching the chest or clutching the arm, that kind of thing. Women don't always experience a heart attack in the same way. They have different kinds of symptoms, that they can't undo their bra straps, they can't, you know, reach around and that kind of thing. But that's not associated with a heart attack. So a lot of women have gone undiagnosed and have even died because they're experiencing a heart attack, but that's not how we define the symptoms of heart attack. So this idea of understanding that there's a gap, right? There's a data gap in how we identify symptoms or actually treat, right? She also goes into a wonderful example about the pharmaceutical industry, that pills are created for male symptoms or male versions or physiologically for men, and that we don't take into account that there are differences between the male and female body, and that has an impact on the efficacy of how the pill will actually work. So she tries to point out this idea that, okay, let's start to pay attention. Let's not demonize, but let's start to pay attention to the fact that there are some significant physiological or psychological differences that are at play here. And then if we go back to, so if we take this idea, the lack of women in STEM could lead us to a situation where we're in this sort of gender data gap. And where could this gender data gap actually take us? It could take us to products that are specifically gendered. And I won't get into it today, but sex robots are actually a big deal these days. And so if you're talking about the extreme of gendered robotics prototypes, all you have to do is Google that. But don't right now. Let's just give me 5 more minutes. Right, so that's when you get into extreme examples of products that are actually gendered. But then if we consider the disproportionate impact on women. So I go back to my days when I was working on the team with the surgical robots, and I used to have these conversations with the nurses. And of course, again, I understand that not all nurses are female. At the time, the ones that I was speaking with were female, so I am loosely putting this into the box of a gender distinction. But the nurses that I would speak to, they talked about the impact on them when the surgical robot was introduced. So now they had to have a whole new set of skills, and they had to have a whole new set of tasks upon them, because the surgical robots fall under minimally invasive surgery. So the whole idea is that you can get patients out of the hospital faster. You recover faster. Right? But if you're recovering faster, you still need someone to help take care of you to a certain extent, but it's usually the family members. But you still need someone to tell the family members what to do to help take care of you, and that is the nurse now. Right? So the nurse, instead of having you in a bed and being able to take care of you, is now thinking about what your care is going to look like at home, what to teach, what to remind people to do. So the nurse's role changed. The nurse's role in the surgical suite changed, right? They're no longer sitting beside a conventionally open surgery, handing tools and whatnot. They're sitting beside the robot, waiting in case they have to switch to conventional methods. So now their whole skill set in the surgical suite has to change. And that wasn't taken into consideration in the evaluation of the technology or in the implementation of the technology. So there was a voice, and whether we call this a gendered voice or just a role, right? It was surgeon versus nurse. But there was a voice that is missing in the actual implementation and evaluation of these tools. So that's one example of how there can be a disproportionate impact on individuals. That the needs of the surgeon are consistently assessed, whereas the needs of the nurses were hidden, were ignored. Another example has to do with the lack of the voice of the nurse or the caretaker on the design team. And that can also create a disproportionate impact in terms of understanding what the person is actually doing in their job. So my PhD research was really about how to explain care tasks so that roboticists could understand that it was more than just this mechanical task of lifting a person up and putting them into a chair. That the nurse is doing so much more in that moment than just the lifting and moving, right? And it's not just about the speed that you lift or the amount of pressure or that kind of thing, but it's also about eye contact, about forming a relationship. And that relationship is so important, because you need to have that relationship in order for patients to be honest about their symptoms, to take their medication, to comply with their care plan. So this moment is huge, right? And so I would suggest things like in a hospital setting where you need to have moments where you can establish these kinds of relationships, whether it's through eye contact, whether it's through touch, assessing the patient and how they're doing, but you can have different robotic solutions. It doesn't mean, I wasn't saying don't have robots at all. Just saying think about the best kind of robot solution. But this had to do with the fact that there was no exchange, there was no sort of communication between the people who were doing the lifting and the people who were making the technology. And so whether this is, role-specific or gender-specific, still, a voice is missing. The voice of the caretaker is missing in a lot of the robot solutions that are provided in a healthcare situation. And then when we, take this to the extreme, of course, chatbots are most often on our phones, but when you think of personal home assistants like Amazon Alexa, the next stage, right? Amazon is already in the experimental stages to help blind people and elderly people as, health companions. And think about what kind of capabilities you would want. Well, for so many people who are experiencing anxiety or who have thoughts of suicide, right now there are different chatbots that are integrated into the possible reduction of these worries. And so if we don't think about, now go back to the heart attack example that I was suggesting, right? What happens when we codify some of the problems of the gender data gap? What happens when we don't understand that there are differences between females and males, and we have the lack of the female data? And then we have training of the actual algorithm that's going to help decide whether or not you need to go to the hospital or you're okay, you need to stay home and let's talk you through it. And then we have that goes into the robot. And we already have the tendency to overtrust the robot. See where I went there? Yeah? 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 So it's a big, this is a huge question, yeah? And it's not so simple as like, okay, we can just, fix one thing and we're okay. But it also doesn't have to be this way. So that was the part of the talk where I was showing how ethics can be like, but then, switch that, and yeah, it doesn't have to be this way. Part of the job of the ethicist is to help figure out what is going on and why this is so problematic. But the other part is to help, find solutions. And so let's imagine what if we want to fix this problem, what does the virtuous cycle look like? Yeah, if we started with the vicious cycle, where do we want to go? Well, of course we want equal benefits to women. Of course we want to have inclusive robotics and AI. And then how do we get there, right? We need to somehow close this gender data gap, and perhaps one way to do that is more women in STEM. But we also need to be careful, right? We don't want to be paternalistic and say, okay, now all women have to be roboticists so that we can close this gap. That's not what we want. What Perez was also talking about with the gender data gap is that we weren't paying attention to the female experience. So maybe it's not about all women needing to become roboticists, but it's about paying attention to the fact that there are differences in experiences. And of course, I'm focusing right now on the gender gap, but diversity is about much more than just gender diversity. So I bracket that, and the reason why I'm doing gender is because of the day that we have. Okay, so then that's great. We have this virtual cycle. Now what do we do? Well, then we have to get specific about who is responsible and what it is that they're responsible for. And in some of the work that I do, I'm sort of trying to target different areas, different ways that we can find solutions. One of those is technical solutions, right? You can look at the way that robots look, the capabilities that robots have. Does a robot have a female submissive voice? Does it have a commanding male voice? That kind of thing. So you can, there's a bucket of kind of technical solutions that you can look at for, balancing the proportionate impact on individuals. Governance structures, right? We heard this morning about the equal opportunity policies that Bonn has now in terms of hiring new recruits and the retired professors and so on and so forth. So it's about establishing those mechanisms. But another approach could be this, co-development idea. This idea of having ethicists embedded into the design team. And so this goes back to, the slides where I had ethics at the end of the design process and ethics at the beginning of the design process. This is what it means to have ethics at the beginning of the design process. To have ethicists who are a part of the thinking. To have ethicists who are thinking about the possibility of a gender data gap. And what could we do? What could we do with this design process, with this robot, with this data set for training the algorithm? How can we work on that? So it's not necessarily about, forcing women into doing certain kinds of jobs, but it's about being aware of the fact that there is a gap and that we can do something about it. And so my job, or the kind of thing that I do, is sort of like ethics hacking, which I can't say to a whole bunch of technical people because you know what hacking is, but it's the same sort of idea, that it's really about pushing the boundaries on problem solving. And then, this is about looking at representation of robots, and how this can impact people in a different way. So how, robots look. This is one of the new sex robots that are coming out, or the kinds of roles that we want robots to do in the educational space. And are we paying attention to the people who are in those jobs right now? The needs, the variety of things that they have to deal with. Are they a part of the design process? Or do we have a data gap in that respect? Or the kinds of ways that assistants are portrayed. Is this the kind of image that we want to have? And again, looking at the top, right? Do we want to have, can we strive for more balanced images that would, increase the acceptance by a larger group of people about these robots? So when you think about, those are the kinds of questions that ethicists can be asking about how people will experience the impact, how people will perceive this capability or this appearance over another. And this can be one way. So one way is more women in STEM, but another way of closing the gap, up there, is by inserting the ethicists into the design team and giving them the explicit role and responsibility of asking this type of question. Okay, so to recap, traditional professor form, where I started. Where did I start? I started talking about how there was no ethics in my life. Remember that? No, I started by talking about this vicious cycle in robotics, that this is part of the idea of responsible robotics. How do we make robotics in a responsible way? What does that look like? And the one thing that I wanted to point out was that there seems to be this cycle right now, this cycle that is directly linked with the lack of female presence in this space and how it, fosters itself. And that the lack of female presence is one factor that can contribute to this thing called the gender data gap. And the result of the gender data gap might be this unequal impact of robots, that they're experienced differently in both a positive and a negative sense. And that as a way of trying to overcome this, we can actually use ethics as a resource, that it's not meant to stifle innovation, that it's meant to inspire new and different kinds of innovation. And that when we embrace it in that way, we can move on to what could be considered a virtuous cycle of robotics, sorry. Okay, so with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll take any questions that you have.